gonna get banned. They're gonna think I'm macroing, just spamming 5 and pressing 4 every now and then.
Macroing? What were you doing? I was testing to see how shit Nova was.
Hello and welcome to the Warframe tier list. Today we'll be going over Nova, and first things first, let's go into the build. Of course it is Nova, so there are multiple builds. The first build is just a Speedva build with Cloak Arrow, as Speedva trades KPM for her survivability, so it is very hard to stay alive, which is why I recommend Cloak Arrow. I'm running a high range build to make the Cloak Arrow bubble a little bit more manageable. Alternatively, you can run a bit more duration, but I feel that having a 179 duration is perfectly fine, which is why I prefer this build. Also, you can freely drop either Arcane Energize or Primed Flow to slot anything in one of those two slots, but you need one or the other. Speedva also relies on Vazarin for Protective Sling for even more iframes. Even with Cloak Arrow and Protective Sling, her survivability is still very mediocre. Now on to the second build. It is a Slova build with Terrify with its augment to make Terrify apply a slow to the enemies to stack with Molecular Prime. This build opts for Moderai for a further 50% casting speed and 40% ability strength. With Molt Augmented, this gives us 200% ability strength, making it so Terrify is guaranteed to full strip the enemies and increasing the potency of Terrify and Molecular Prime slows. And the third build is a tank Slova build with Arcane Blessing and Molecular Fission, choosing to keep Nullstar. I'm also using Silence. Alternatively, you can use Gloom, but I found Silence to work just as well and I preferred it. The only downside to Silence is you need a way to heal yourself. There are multiple ways to do this, such as dropping Molt Efficiency for Molt Reconstruct. This means that every time you pressure 4, you heal for 600 health. You can run a Praetos, which is what I recommend on Nova. And on the tank build, you are free to drop Shattering Impact for healing return. Another way to heal yourself is by using Magish Repair on your operator to heal your max health by 25% for every second you're in Void mode. And you're also free to use whatever focus tree you want on this build, such as Vazarin for Protective Sling again for the iframes and the heal, and Squad Regen if you can be bothered to proc it. It takes 5 seconds to proc and it lasts for 60 seconds. Your other and final source of healing is of course the Panzer with Viral Quills and Hunter Recovery. As for the rest of the build, it is just your AoE weapon of choice. I prefer the Tonkor because it has a high Riven dispo. If you do not care for Rivens, then feel free to use any other AoE weapon such as the Brahma. And the secondary, I chose the Nukor for dealing with nullifiers, but again, you're free to use whatever you want. I was using a Nukor with secondary dexterity for the combo duration for my Praetos. If you don't care about combo duration for your melee weapon, obviously use Flare instead. Now that is it for the builds, and let's move on to the rankings. Alright, we will be discussing Nova in relation to 4 separate topics. Firstly, her KPM, secondly, her survivability, thirdly, her viability, and finally, how fun she is to play. All of this data is sampled from a 1-hour solo Steel Path Mott run with no Spectres and no on-call. With Nova, since she has differing playstyles, I will consider both of them, give them both separate rankings for each category, and take the average and apply that for her ranking. Alright, so now let's get started with the first topic, Nova's KPM. So first things first, I'll just talk about what both builds do, and that is make all enemies affected take 2x damage from all sources. This sounds really good on paper until you realize that it doesn't work on shields, and it also doesn't work on overguard. This means that high priority targets that you actually want to kill quickly and you struggle to kill normally don't actually take additional damage while affected from Molecular Prime. This is bad because enemies that don't have overguard or don't have shields typically die instantly anyway, because those are just like lancers and butchers. The only enemies that don't really have overguard or shields that are actually hard to kill are just standard heavy gunners and bombards, but targets that will actually kill you, such as any Eximus or, for instance, MOAs. If you know, you know. MOAs are unironically a huge threat that do kill you, especially if you're in invis frame, which Speedva is using cloak arrow to go invis. MOAs are a huge pain, and they are very tanky, which again, if you know, you know. If you've ever done a level cap run, you know how tanky MOAs are. They are absurd. And since they're mostly shield, Nova doesn't actually deal additional damage to them. This means that Nova's scaling potential actually isn't that high, because in her builds you don't really have space for a damage amplifier to slot in with Helmet. So you're entirely relying on Molecular Prime, but again, it just doesn't work on what you need it to work on. This means that by herself, Nova really can't scale that well into Steel Path. Eventually she just won't deal enough damage to kill the enemies. And God forbid you ever have to fight a Guardian Eximus, because not only do they have Overguard, but they also have a lot of shield. Guardian Eximus are an absolute pain to deal with as Nova. Now, all of that being said, let's move on to Speedva specific topics. So Speedva has insanely high KPM. In my Speedva run, I got 7.8k kills in 60 minutes, and it was the first try, so I wasn't entirely sure how to play it, and I died multiple times. I got downed probably double digits and had to revive myself with my operator in last stand at least 10 times, and I did full die once. And I still managed nearly 8k kills. That is an insanely high KPM, but again, remember that she doesn't really scale, as she doesn't have a real damage buff to allow her weapons to scale into the later levels. Because of these reasons, I'm going to give Speedva's KPM an S- because she lacks any sort of scaling. Now moving on to Slova, and Slova should be pretty obvious. She has a very, very low KPM. So the reason that Slova has a low KPM is, of course, because she's slowing enemies down from very far distances away, just meaning that there will be less enemies on screen at any given time compared to if you weren't slowing them down. Not only this, but you're not only affecting yourself if you're playing Slova, you're lowering the KPM for your entire team by playing Slova, because you just affect such a large radius. For these reasons, I'm going to give Speedva an S- rank for KPM because you lack scaling, and I'm going to give Slova a B-. This leads to an averaged out KPM ranking of an A-. Now moving on to survivability, again I will start with Speedva, and Speedva is fairly short and simple. As I said earlier, Speedva obviously trades her survivability to increase her and her group's KPM. However, she needs Vazarin and Cloak Arrow. Either Vazarin or Cloak Arrow almost instantaneously mean F tier for survivability, because you're pretty much admitting that your frame is so bad that you have to run one of these two things just to survive. But Nova needs both of them. So it really is just an instant F, and there's really not much more to elaborate it. And as for Slova, it's really not too much better for her either. So, Nova as a Warframe has very low base stats. Her armor is very, very average for a Prime, and her health is also below average as well. So if you're going a health tank build, you basically just have subpar base stats, and you're just relying on Arcane Blessing to try to carry you with her one with molecular fusion augment to keep your damage reduction from her one active. The problem even with this is how it works is it's constantly shedding the DR, so you almost never have the full DR from the one. You will pretty much always be sitting around 75 to 85% damage reduction, which if you've played this game enough, you know that even with 2k health and 80 to 90% damage reduction, you will still occasionally just get one shot by a Bombard or a Blitz Eximus. And even if you go a Slova build with a shield gate setup instead of a health tank build, it's not too much better because Nova has very long cast times on Terrify, if you choose to subsume that, and her 4. Both of them have extremely long cast times, and you can't really afford to slot natural talent anywhere in the build, meaning that occasionally you will just die, even on a shield gate build, due to being locked in animations. Because of all of these reasons, Speedva gets an F, and Slova gets a B, leading to an overall survivability ranking of C-. Now, moving on to the next topic, Nova's viability. And this is where Nova truly shines, but it still isn't fantastic. Nova is a really great Warframe, and a pre-made team, as long as you are the third or fourth person. A nuke frame or a Khora or a Necros are significantly more important if your goal is to get loot. A Speedva will never outshine the loot that a Necros or a Khora will generate. That being said, if you have a Khora, Nova is very, very important as you need to get the enemies inside of Khora's range as quickly as possible. But if you don't have a Khora, and say you have a Necros and a nuke frame, a second Necros will more likely outshine the higher KPM that a Nova would offer. The reason for this is Nova doesn't actually increase the KPM of a good nuke frame as much as you think it would. I had my friend do a 30-minute mot run by himself on his nuke Mirage, and he got roughly 182 KPM over those 30 minutes. I then joined him, and we did another 30-minute run in the same room layout, and the KPM went from 182 to about 214, meaning that Nova is only a roughly 18 to 20% KPM increase, meaning that a second Necros is actually a better loot generator than the first Nova. But if you have a 4-man team like Khora, Necros, then Nova is very, very good. Speedva is also very good for low to mid to high level defense missions, but again, nuke frames are significantly better than a Speedva here. As for Slova, Slova only really has true viability and excavation missions, but again, you are probably noticing a theme here. A Frost or a Zephyr are again significantly more important than the Nova. Frost and Zephyr both make the Excavator mostly immune, other than to melee enemies or Blitz Eximus, but Slova just slows them down. What's better, slowing them down or making them outright immune to 95% of the threats? Obviously making them immune. But she is still good as a second or third option. Because of all of these reasons, I will give her viability an A-, just because she has so many niches where she is very good in them, And the only reason it's not higher is because, again, she's like the last pick. Now, moving on to the final topic, how fun is Nova to play? And again, this is fairly short and sweet. I personally find her to be very boring, all of her playstyles. The reason for this is because Cloak Arrow is extremely limiting and boring. You're just standing still, shooting Cloak Arrow. If you're in a group comp, you're standing still, shooting Cloak Arrow, and just spamming your transference key over and over and over again. It is extremely boring. And if you're playing Slova, then honestly, the name itself should tip you off. Like, you're just slowing the enemies down, you're fighting less enemies, it's just not fun. Not to mention that she has the long cast times and very bad survivability, which definitely does not help her case for how fun she is to play. I will give her fun rank a C-, and even that I think is being a little generous. In conclusion, Nova is a C+ tier Warframe who is very good in very specific niche pieces of content, but for just general use, she's very, very average.
What you have learned here will serve you well.
Oh my god, I want to die. This is cringe.
Listen, hear me out. What about running a Warframe with
Right, this
Equinox?
is cringe to like the 12th degree.